Well, this is I guess a follow-up to my last R-naught video, which now is about 6 days ago, 5 days ago, 6 days ago. The days are starting to blur together. Sorry it's taken me this long. There were a couple little real-life emergencies on my end of the world here, but nothing serious. Everything's been sorted out, and back to our self-isolated existences. So this will be again about the R-naught value, and that R-naught will go below 1. If you've seen the previous video, you know what that means, that if we can get it below 1, we can get this disease under control, and that's bound to happen eventually, and it's going to happen one of 3 ways, and our actions are going to be the way in which we choose which of those 3 options it becomes. So for those of you who haven't been watching Dr. John, one of his new sayings is take R-naught to less than 1 for the crisis to be done. And as always, I strongly encourage everyone to take a look at Dr. John's daily updates. He's been doing this constantly every day and keeping everyone informed. So if he's willing to do the work, we should be willing to spend the short amount of time needed to keep up on what's happening here. So the 3 ways in question. Number 1 is herd immunity. Bad, very bad is what I have written there. Just to give a really quick example of herd immunity. First off, this is a novel virus, so we have no natural immunity in the population at all. So to get to herd immunity, we would have to let very large portions of the population get infected in a very short period of time. That's what we're trying to avoid with flattening the curve. The reason that we're trying to do that is, let's assume for a second that the common flu, our seasonal flu, had no herd immunity or vaccine in the population, and that it was a brand new virus from our perspective. I'll show the numbers a little later for how I derive these, but if we were to assume that, then in Ottawa, a city of 1 million people, we could assume that throughout the flu season we would lose 600 people. That would be 600 deaths, and we would hospitalize 9,000 people. That's from the common seasonal flu. COVID-19 is considerably worse than that, and we have no immunity to it. So yes, the end result there is bad, very bad. Which I assume is what the UK government was told when this was their strategy, and they very quickly realized that that will no longer be their strategy. So the strategy everyone's working on right now is vaccine. That's number 2. It's 12 to 18 months away, and we hope that's the case for various reasons. I'll get into some of the more depressing ones a little further into this video. But depressing enough for the moment is we can keep in mind that we have been trying to get a vaccine together for HIV for decades, pretty much my entire lifetime. Yeah, actually my entire lifetime. So we haven't pulled that off yet, and we've been trying really hard. So vaccines are not easy to make, especially not for viruses that we don't have a lot of experience with. And number 3 is transmission extinction. Now this one is basically what we're trying to do by reducing the R-naught below 1. Now this would be us, like everyone, working together to make sure that the virus has no opportunity to get to a new host. If we can break every one of those chains, then the virus dies off completely without the need for a vaccine. And this, unfortunately, might be the only chance that we're really going to have due to some data that we'll get into a little further on. But yeah, coronaviruses are not not very good viruses for being able to build up effective long-term antibodies against, which we kind of know because our common cold is a coronavirus, and we can quite regularly get multiple colds throughout one season. So that is a concern that some data is starting to come back showing we might need to really think about those concerns. All right, so let's look a little deeper into herd immunity. Like I said, being a novel virus, there's no existing immunity in the population right now. So in order to get that herd immunity, we need to really let a lot of people get infected really fast. So let's just take a quick look at an example that I put together for Ottawa. A, that's where I live. B, we have a nice little population number of 1 million, which makes the math pretty easy. So we will use a range of scenarios for the R-naught value. For those of you who did see part 1 of the earlier video that I did on the R-naught value, you will have seen this chart before, and that's the chart that we're using to derive, based on the R-naught value, how much of the population will be required to get to herd immunity. Again, just for those of you who haven't seen it, this chart is using the assumption that there's no previous immunities, either natural or artificial, so either people who have recovered or people who have been vaccinated in the population. So this particular chart made by Tom Britton is normally a theoretical study, but in the case of COVID-19 is almost a real-world situation. Now, I do also want to be clear, I don't know if I was clear enough in the last video, that this particular chart only exists so long, or these values only exist so long as there is no natural or artificial immunity in the population. So once a second wave or third wave or however many waves comes in, this will not be the curve that we look at because, as Tom shows in the video that I'll link below, if we even have half of the population having a previous immunity to it, then that very much changes how large a group of the population will get infected in the second wave before things start to fizzle out again. But in the first wave, if we have our R-naught at 1.5, that's going to be 60%. You can see that by 1.5 coming up to roughly 60%. 80% for R-naught of 2, 90% for 2.5, 95% for an R-naught of 3. So if we remember, our official R-naught numbers are 2.5 to 3. We're going to look at situations A, B, C, and D, which would be the 1.5 to 2.5 and 3. We're not going to go above that, but as we've looked at in previous videos before, we do have observed situations that show that in at least some situations the R-naught value could be considerably higher for this particular virus. We are going to use a range of CFRs, that's case fatality rates. So the WHO has given an estimate of 3.4%. Now, luckily, in a lot of situations, that seems high. In a lot of situations, that unfortunately seems low. Now, we will not have a proper CFR for a very long time because we all recognize that there are a lot of undiagnosed or unofficial cases right now. And the more of those that we tally later in the outbreak, once we are able to do antibody tests and really get an idea of who's already been infected and recovered, then we'll start to see the CFR rates for a lot of countries go down dramatically because we'll have more people in the overall infected caseload Therefore, the percentage of those cases that result in death will start to become lower. Right now, they appear artificially high in a lot of countries because we don't have the amount of testing that we'd like to have, and the tests that we do are on people that are already in the hospital situation, so it makes them more likely to unfortunately become part of the death category. So once we get better testing and are able to tally up all of the mild and asymptomatic cases, that will greatly reduce the CFRs that we're seeing in some countries. So real-world data ranges go from 14% to 0.45%. And I'll just show you here. I'm just getting a lot of that from this nice and easy chart that it looks like some Oxford people took the Worldometers data and gave us a nice easy chart showing that at the moment, unfortunately, Algeria is showing 14.81 now. I can tell you that Algeria, that is definitely a false reading because their testing is very low. I was looking into them in particular because I do have a family out there, so we would love to see some higher testing results from Algeria to get a better picture of what's going on, but you'll see Italy is currently showing in the 12.5% range. On the other end of the chart, we have New Zealand, all the way down at 0.45. So they're actually at 0.08. So we're using this as the center range. So for my calculation, I've used New Zealand's higher range, it appears. So we've got three different situations here. Scenario 1 is going to be the high range of New Zealand, so 0.45. That is low for most countries, as you'll see on this list. Almost all of them are up above the 1% range. Scenario 2 is going to be the 1% range, and scenario 3, we're going to go as high as the WHO's estimate. There's really no reason to go any higher than that, because as I said, any of those higher numbers that currently exist are likely artifacts of the lack of testing. And to be perfectly honest, 3.4% is bad enough. It really is. Hospitalization rate ranges, that's 12% to 22% depending on the population and the resources of their public health systems. For us, we're going to use 15%, which is actually what Ottawa's real-world data is, according to Ottawa Public Health right now. It's April 9th that they released that particular one, so it might be slightly different now. It is the 11th after all, although very early in. Finally, there's going to be a flu comparison down here, just to give you an idea of the difference going on between the flu and COVID. So, yeah, it's not good, as you can see these numbers. In our best case scenario with COVID, if we had 60% of the population infected and only a case fatality rate of 0.45, then we would be looking at 2,700 deaths with 90,000 total hospitalized. As we go up the chain, so scenario B again was 80%, 90%, and 95%. And our scenario 1 was the 0.45% case fatality rate. So even then, if we're looking at anything above an R-naught of 3, then we're looking just in Ottawa alone at over 4,000 deaths. Really, and anything over a 2.5. As soon as we get into the World Health Organization's realm of CFR, then the numbers get pretty close to what our federal government is expecting for the entire country by the end of this pandemic. Now, granted, this is all data as if we were doing no social distancing whatsoever. This would be if things were just left to themselves, which is an illustration of why we are doing the social distancing and all other measures that we're trying to put in place, because we couldn't deal with this in our hospital system. We definitely couldn't deal with this in our hospital system. In fact, if the seasonal flu had no resistance in the population, we couldn't deal with that. We could not deal with 9,000 total people in the hospital system needing beds in a season. Yeah, that would be a 60% infection rate of seasonal flu over a season. That would only be 600 total deaths. I only say only because our best case in COVID would be close to 3,000. Good data to know. Apparently there's 3,400 total hospital beds in the Champlain Health region. That covers Ottawa and the rest of Eastern Ontario. That's what CTV was reporting. They say that of those 304 critical care ventilated beds now. I will link the article in question here because it just seems wrong to me. I think it was this article over here. I have seen other articles as well that I'm sure I've linked in the past that talk about Ottawa itself having 400 ventilators. So I'm not sure where the conflict in data is there, but I've been finding all kinds of conflicting data all over the place. So it might be how it's calculated by different organizations. Also, the average hospital stay is 1 week if you're not ventilated for this disease. If you are put on a ventilator, then it's 2 weeks, and 3 weeks is not unheard of. And if you are on a ventilator, then your chances of getting off of one are unfortunately very low with this disease. I've seen numbers as high as 60% of patients who get onto a ventilator and never get off, or at least never go home when they do. So back to vaccine. That's what we're working on now. That's why we're doing social distancing. We're trying to slow down and really flatten the curve in order to extend that whole herd immunity point as long as possible so that we can get a vaccine and artificially result in herd immunity. But to be fully tested for safety, and especially against something called antibody-dependent enhancement. This is very important, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Vaccine requires at least 8 months of human trials, and preferably 12. So when we get the 12 to 18 month window, that's including those tests. So there's going to be a small human trial for a good chunk of time. The small trials are the ones that we try for at least 8 months. Then there's a larger cohort, larger trial that gives us a better idea of how it works in a large, more diverse population. And those trials, if they show early promise, they can then be rushed into wide use. If they start to show issues, then they would be terminated for a new vaccine, hopefully. But yeah, 12 to 18 months is definitely a optimistic timeline. As I said earlier, HIV, we still don't have a vaccine, and the closest we have for any coronavirus vaccine at the moment, anything in the coronavirus family, is the MERS vaccine, which still has not been fully approved for widespread use. And we've been working on that for, I guess, a decade now, somewhere in that area. So AD, that's the antibody-dependent enhancement. That's the biggest worry with new vaccines, and especially with this one because coronaviruses have shown AD potential in the past. So let's talk a little more about AD quickly here. basically, the idea with ADE is, why am I on Wikipedia? That's kind of useless. The basic idea with ADE is that in certain instances, if you don't have enough antibodies, but you do have some antibodies, a disease can actually be enhanced insofar as how hard it hits your system. So let's go back to Wikipedia just for the hell of it. Basically, it's something called a cytokine storm, which is the most often result. And are they even talking about that in Wikipedia? I'm sure they must be somewhere. But cytokine storm is when your immune system starts to attack your own body. We do have various different diseases which are autoimmune diseases. Some of them do result in that type cytokine storm. Should have looked into this site earlier. Anyhow, if you do type in antibody-dependent enhancement for coronavirus, you will find both some recent articles as well as a lot of previous articles dealing with other types of coronaviruses. So the original SARS as well as MERS. I did find this one interesting. This was originally published. It was received by the Journal on November 27th of 2019. And this is one talking about the antibody-dependent enhancement of MERS in particular. These were literally the first two articles to come up. This one here from end of February. Already we were looking into the possible ADE implications of antibodies from other coronaviruses. So SARS and MERS being two of them, but another 4 of them being what we think of as the common cold. There's kind of 4 flavors of the common cold. Well, there's many more flavors of the common cold, but 4 of them are coronaviruses. And we do have antibodies against those coronaviruses in our system at pretty much all times, but they're not sufficient to keep away the common cold. In fact, at times the ADE process is what makes it feel so much worse when you get a second cold in a season. You'll get an early one in the fall that's not really that bad, and then by the spring when you get another one, it just lasts 4 weeks. And that's partially the ADE process. So COVID-19 has shown some early signs of low antibody loads. Those are called titers. I'm not even sure if I spelled that right. And that makes the risk of reinfection and ADE reactions very, very concerning. So a couple of these articles here. These first 3, I think I got through Chris over at Peak Prosperity. It was in one of his daily updates. Again, people should definitely be watching that. He's been on top of this for a very long time. So this is some Chinese doctors sounding the alarm about patients that catch the disease again, it being a much rougher time. They're talking about sudden death from heart failure. So this could be 2 things. It could be damage to the system from the previous fight with the virus. This could also be some sort of ADE reaction in effect. So low antibody levels raise questions about reinfection risk. Now, this was talking about, where is it? Researchers in Shanghai were looking at the Chinese data from the original Wuhan pandemic, and were finding that some titers, I did spell it right, some of the patients failed to develop high titers of neutralizing antibodies. So some of these patients had pretty much no antibodies at all. Many of them had very low antibodies, although some of them had higher ones. Chris did track down the actual paper itself, which was very nice of him because I didn't have to go and do it. And here it's talking about 2 cases that had very high titer loads, but that there were a number of them, 10 patients, that were undetectable using the type test that they had, which would have done anything above 40 level. And apparently, from what I was reading, anything under a 500 is less than what would be required to fight off a secondary infection, which might be how we're now getting, this is just from today, just from a few hours ago, reports out of South Korea that now 91 patients thought to have been cleared have tested positive again. Now, at the moment, the South Korean figures are, not figures, sorry, the authorities are saying that this is likely that the virus has been reactivated, in the sense that it went dormant, it was being fought off by the immune system, and somehow it jumped back up again and started its attack. In all honesty, that's kind of worrying in and of itself, but this is apparently better than the actual idea of a reinfection, which I guess I kind of agree with as well. But it's worth knowing that on Friday they reported 27 new cases. Now, where was it that I was seeing that they had 51 on Monday? By Friday, they're at 91, and it might have been in this article that was telling us that last week they were at about 14. So it does appear like the more that they release some of the lockdown measures, because South Korea, well, using masks and social distancing and an informed public has worked wonderfully for them. There have also been the need for lockdown measures and stay-at-home measures, and as they're starting to reduce some of those now that they really do have the curve under control, it appears like they're starting to get a number of reinfections, or these reactivations as they're calling them. So that, mixed with the low titer count of antibodies, is very concerning for the vaccine front. So if options 1 and 2 are off the table, what's next? And that's the transmission extinction line. This is not normally how we do this, to be honest. We in the case of an endemic disease like the flu or the cold, we normally just treat what we can, deal with what we can't, and work on getting a vaccine. But as we know from the seasonal flu, we need a different vaccine every year for that. And it's starting to look like we're going to need that for COVID as well, if that even works. So it's possible that the vaccines will be incredibly short term, like just 1 season, if even that long. It might even be partial season, like with a common cold type situation. But our only option might be to try to extinguish literally every transmission line of this virus and try to wipe it off the planet. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be impossible, though. If we really all work at this, this can be done, and it's happened with other pandemic viruses before. If the transmission lines, enough of them can be knocked out, and if enough of the population has antibodies to be able to deflect the other transmission lines that can't be dealt with through social distancing and the other what they're now calling non-pharmaceutical interventions. So this is really going to require all the tricks in the book. So all the non-pharmaceutical interventions, that's everything that we've talked about before in the pandemic response category. So information, cleanliness, distancing, lockdowns, All of those measures are the non-pharmaceutical side of things. We need to do all the testing that we can possibly do. That's both antigen and antibody testing. Even if the antibody levels are low, we need to know who's had the disease and could possibly be susceptible to an increased disease if they get it again in the case of an ADE reaction, or if they have a very high titer level and are basically immune for the time being, they can then be able to work back in more high-risk infection zones. So that's very important information, and we need testing to be able to see where the virus is. If we don't know where the virus is, then we can't use any really more surgical measures other than blanket lockdowns and blanket stay-at-home orders. We need all the treatments, all the prophylactics, and all the vaccines, even if they're only useful for a short term, that we can possibly create. Any of those slows down the ability for the virus to continue to transmit or to infect new people. So that leaves the transmission chains intact. If we can get these going, that will slow down those transmission chains enough that we can get things below that R-naught level of 1. We need everyone informed, everyone on board, and that needs to be all the time. This would need to be global. It's going to be an extreme reduction and delay in international travel. We're going to need quarantine periods for anyone moving from one country to another. The economy is going to have a really, really rough time. And it's going to have to change. Local's going to become a normal option. We're not going to have the same just-in-time delivery system that we had just a few months ago. That's already showing cracks and strains, and if this is going to go on long-term, which is now quite obvious it will, a lot of that is going to have to change. So we need to start looking at how to create communities that are able to assist one another in the creation of the things that we need. Centralized systems, they're going to need to be re-examined and possibly at times replaced. It is somewhat of a concern. So far it hasn't been, but it might become so later in the year when we start hitting air conditioning period. That everyone is at home all the time right now using a whole ton of electricity. Now that is offset somewhat by the reduction in business use, so everything's been great so far. But our systems aren't necessarily built to handle the loads that we're putting on it right now, because they were all designed with different load structures in mind. So that could start to show some strain as this happens for a prolonged time. So we may need to learn a little more self-sufficiency. I've already talked many times about planting gardens. I've been a gardener for a while, so I'm a little biased there. But being able to produce a certain amount of things ourselves is going to put us at an advantage in a lot of the situations that look like they're coming down the pipe here. As we spend more and more money to keep people either employed in or eating if they're unemployed, because we do need to make sure that people have enough funds to be able to get food. Eventually this is going to result in a lot of inflation and a lot of very difficult times ahead as we enter what's probably going to be a prolonged recession period. So yeah, all the effects of this change are going to be difficult, and at times they are going to be horrible. And if we have a situation where this disease can't be fought with a vaccine because we A, either can't create one, or B, it's not going to give us long-term immunity to be able to really get this under control, then the alternatives really are worse. Because the alternatives start to become that herd immunity situation that may or may not even be able to exist. If there's no ability to build up those antibodies at a level that's required for immunity, then there is no herd immunity. There's just a seasonal disease that likely is not going to mutate much, which means it's not even going to get that much nicer to us. The CFR rate that it has now, granted, the one that we're seeing right now is likely artificially high, but it's almost guaranteed to be considerably worse than the flu. And at least with the flu, we build up decent antibodies, and we can actually use vaccines. Yeah, the alternatives really are worse. So if we can extinguish this disease through the hard work and sacrifice that it'll take, we might be able to get back the society that we had, mostly anyway. And if we can't, then maybe we can't. And we've got to start looking at that and figure out what the future might hold. But we're in this for the long haul at the moment, and we need to start looking at what a long-term COVID future might really start to look like. I've been promising you guys part 3 of the original video series for a little while. I will get that out hopefully tomorrow. Same with the video of the masks that I've been making. Yes, for those of you that don't know, I got my sewing machine back out, and I have been playing with cotton masks, so practicing what I preach at this point. The part 3 will be out soon. I'd been hoping for better news to be able to report there, and in some ways there is some better news here and there. So trying to remain hopeful. But again, we are in for some really rough times. Rough times ahead, hopefully better times after that, but we need to get a handle on this whole antibody system. Because if the antibody loads are that low, that could spell some interesting things for the second wave. Memories of 1918 that would not be very good. Anyways, guys, it's late. I'm tired. I should probably stop talking before I ramble forever, and this, I'm sure, is already longer than it had any right to be. Thanks for sticking with me and listening. I always do appreciate it. And take care, guys. Stay safe, and I will talk to you soon.